Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. That was good, thank you. My name is Jacques Berlinerblau, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I want to welcome each and every one of you to what is going to be a spectacular day-long conference, the second Biennial Stoltz Family Conference on European Anti-Semitism. The first Biennial conference took place on February 29th, 2016, and it marked the birth and inauguration of the Center for Jewish Civilization. So we do these every 2 years. They are usually focused on the grim subject of anti-Semitism, and we're absolutely delighted to have all of you and our distinguished speakers today. We have a staggeringly fascinating lineup in front of us today. The person who's going to be telling you about it, I will introduce in a moment. She is the Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Civilization, and if some of you are wondering what is the Center for Jewish Civilization, it is an undergraduate research and teaching unit in the School of Foreign Service. We have 22 faculty members. We had 650 students sitting in our classes last semester. We have a nice hefty endowment because of Mr. Bob Burkett, who is the senior advisor to President Jack DeGioia, of $21 million. And we have a general sense of joy, mirth, happiness, and camaraderie in our unit, and we're very, very happy to put on events such as this one. The person who conceived everything today, all right, who thought of the speakers, who found the subject, who identified the areas of intellectual interest, is the Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Civilization, Dr. Anna Sommer-Schneider. So when you welcome her and as you clap a little harder because we have a person that has put together a fantastic program and has spent hours and hours and hours, hundreds of hours, curating the talent that we have on stage today. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our Associate Director, Dr. Anna Sommer-Schneider.
And I think I'm getting a special prize. It's going to be that nice cell phone for putting this nice conference together. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you for this kind of words, and good morning, everybody. I know it's been very early morning for all of us, but also the topic of this conference is not only important, but I should say is above all timely. Certainly it's been a really disturbing time for America. We all know just a few days after a Florida man was arrested for sending bombs to prominent elected and business officials and the media, we witnessed the most horrific attack on the Jewish worshippers in the Pittsburgh synagogue on Shabbat and during the sacred celebration of the birth of the child. And of course, today we know that this slaughter was motivated by anti-Semitism and also hatred. For the last 20 years, as a Holocaust professor and also educator in a former concentration and extermination camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, I've been reminding my students that every violence, every crime, and also every genocide always starts with words, never active killing. And hate speech present in different spheres of our lives. It's unacceptable, specifically hate speech prevailing in social media and racist and xenophobic language promoted or often ignored by political leaders in different countries. So we cannot ignore the reality that promoting hate has the consequence of hateful acts. Of course, one leads inevitably to the other. The Pittsburgh killer proved this. His rant and hatred-filled social media postings leave as proof that the oldest form of hatred, anti-Semitism, is alive and well also here in the United States. So how do we measure this American tragedy and the underlying factors to what we are witnessing in Europe today? In both instances, here and in Europe, political rhetoric and nationalism or national populism, if you like, has taken on a different and outsized tenor than anything we have experienced in many years. As first, and feel free to fill any country you like, has resulted in a dramatic nativism in many European countries, which is turning some in the political and government class against individuals and institutions, particularly those who are viewed as strangers. So this has not unsurprisingly corresponded with a rising level of anti-Semitism, nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and hatred. So how can we explain these parallel transformations taking place in the United States and Europe, given that these changes are not necessarily motivated by democratic depression or the like? Well, today, history may feel circular. The cultural and political divide, which is being felt, seems similar to other times in European history when the fringe voices rose in anger and resentment. The 19th century Dreyfus affair in France, triggered by the fake news of the day, divided the nation along now familiar lines. Those who spoke against Dreyfus were, I would say, the alt-right of their time, which was supported by France's right-wing newspapers and a chattering class. So this sort of climate was a perfect breeding ground for rising nationalism, which fostered the perfect environment for anti-Semitism to flourish. Is this problem unique to Europe? Of course not. Only 4 years ago, one of our panelists, who's present in his room today, Konstanty Gebert, spoke about my native Poland as a boring country, and I hope you don't mind if I quote from your paper. He said, "When I was young, I had hoped that eventually I might live out my days in a boring country. And here I am, nobody much covers Poland anymore, because there is nothing remarkable to cover. It is just a boring, regular, democratic country like everywhere else." End of quote. And here we are. Only 4 years later, Poland, along with some other European countries, is not really that boring anymore. Political leaders are grabbing headlines and the news, particularly in the context of declining democracy. But one thing is for sure, the trend line in corners of Europe, America, and even in Latin America is one of stronger nationalist and populist voices, which certainly adds fuel to an already problematic cocktails against Jews and others. So today, we gather here in America's capital city at this great university to examine what we are seeing on the old continent of Europe and the rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. Why is it that only 2 generations after the Holocaust, Europe faces a constellation of threats, including rising populism, political nationalism, and anti-Semitism? These worrying trends are stimulated by various political and nationalist voices have called for an end of the liberal international order prevailing in Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world. What can we do to protect the important steps towards tolerance and inclusion that have been won in recent decades? How can the European Union and its member states demonstrate their commitment to the fundamental rights of citizens to live in peace and free from abuse and fear in order to ensure that Jewish life can continue in Europe? We have to remember that Europe witnessed the devastating and unforgivable consequences of anti-Semitism and hatred that cannot be forgotten. So perhaps today, while we examine the current situation in Europe, we can also think about the prescriptions to better ensure civility, tolerance, and fighting targeted hatred also here in the United States. And as we begin our program, I would like to thank my wonderful boss, Professor Jacques Berlineblaum, the head of the Center for Jewish Civilization, for making this conference possible. I want to thank Anna Dubinsky, our chief of staff, for all her support. Our wonderful students who volunteer today during this conference. And most of all, I want to thank Jocelyn Flores, our CJC Holocaust Bremen Program Coordinator, without whose the devoted work, really hard work, hours spent on helping to put this conference together, this whole event wouldn't be possible. Thank you, and I would like to now invite Mr. Ira Forman to, or you can just...
I think I'll do it from here, if you don't mind.
All right, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Forman and our panelists for this morning's session.
Our distinguished panel. The topic of this morning's panel is, of course, Enduring Legacy, Rising Anti-Semitism in Europe. And my name is Ira Forman. I am the adjunct professor and senior fellow at the Center for Jewish Civilization. I teach a course right after this seminar called Confronting Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And we're going to deal with the same topic, or at least part of the topic. We're going to be dealing with Western Europe this afternoon. So we're obviously dealing with a serious topic. And it was brought home to me, I think, right after I left my former position. I was the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the U.S. State Department. A couple of my colleagues from the State Department are here. And I was looking for a job. And I had many of you who have teenage sons or daughters. I have a daughter and two sons. And my two sons love nothing more than to torture and tease their father. So I was looking for work, and the first thing that my eldest son said to me, well, even you should be able to find work. You're in a growth industry working on anti-Semitism. And that's very serious, because it's seriously true. I want to deal with this, a number of questions this morning. I hope the panel is going to focus on a number of things, including why are we talking about Europe when we talk about anti-Semitism? What is the future, if there is a future? Some have questioned that, for Jews in the continent and in the UK. I think we want to also touch on the real complexity and very different forms of anti-Semitism that face very different Jewish communities throughout Europe. I think I'd like to also make sure, and I know the panel will address, the really different forms of anti-Semitism. And of course, in the wake of Pittsburgh, I think all of us are thinking, are there lessons or are there things that are happening in Europe that may be coming here? So we'll do this by opening with each of our panelists having 5 to 10 minutes to talk a little bit about their experience. We'll then go to Q&A. I will ask the panelists either all of them or individually a number of questions, and then we will leave some serious time for questions for the audience. So this is a panel with great gravity. One of the things I noted in looking, I know some of them, met two of them before, worked real closely with one of them. One of the things that struck me is two of the people on this panel have been working since 2001 and the Durban Conference in South Africa, which was a milepoint in anti-Semitism and the revival of anti-Semitism in the world. They have seen an amazing amount of events and, I would say, of evolution of this disease. I've been doing this for only something like 6 years. And for having people go back to the beginning of the century on this is really, we're really honored to have them doing this. So on my immediate right is Rabbi Andrew Baker. Rabbi Baker is the director of the International Affairs for the American Jewish Committee. At least I didn't say Congress.
I'll be thankful for that.
He also, since January of 2009, has served as the personal representative of the OsCE, that's the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, Chairperson-in-Office on combating anti-Semitism, and that is a yearly appointment. He has been reappointed year after year after year, which is fairly unusual in these positions. He's a longtime officer of the Jewish Claims Conference. As I said, he's been working in this field for a long time. He has all kinds of decorations from various European nations. He's past president of the Washington Board of Rabbis. I could go on and on, but Andy is, when we work on anti-Semitism at the State Department, I really learned a lot about the overview of kind of worldwide anti-Semitism from Andy. I continue to use him as a resource, et cetera. He's a real value to the whole community. Next to Andy, to his right, is Karen Pollack. Karen is the chief executive of the Holocaust Educational Trust in the United Kingdom. She started her professional life working for the Parliamentary Committee Against Anti-Semitism, PCAA, and she became the director of that organization. She joined the Holocaust Educational Trust as their communications director in '98 and has since become their chief executive. She has been, as I mentioned, she was the representative of the Board of Deputies of British Jewry at the Durban Conference. She has a number of very impressive things on her resume. The one thing culturally that stuck out to me was she has a title, MBE, Member of the Most Excellent Order of the Empire. So
My parents are very proud.
I know. Well, and I was wondering immediately if I had to call you Dame, but apparently not. It's one or two steps up the chivalry ladder
really
to get
low
to
down
Dame,
the list.
but pretty impressive. I think we needed to talk about that. And we're, again, she has some, I think especially, I keep something called Anti-Semitism Monitor on Moment Magazine's website, which is a monitoring of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic events throughout the world, day by day, country by country. If you look at that list to this year, by far the longest, the United States is not a distant second, but second, longest list of incidents is the UK. That would not have been the case in 2017. So I'm interested in hearing from Karen and her insights. Finally, if I can find my notes here, we have Benjamin Weinthal, who is with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He is a research fellow there. He's a widely published journalist. He's the FDD's eyes and ears in Europe. He has done investigative reporting on Iran's energy and links to European firms, on Hamas and Hezbollah. He's examined the growth of the Islamic State in detail. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, Europe, Slate, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Weekly Standard, National Review Online, Israeli dailies, English language dailies such as Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, as well as BBC and Fox News. A fluent German speaker, he also writes for a number of German dailies. So without further ado, let's go to our panelists. And Andy, could you give us your impressions about this topic?
Sure, Ira, thank you. And thank you all for having us. I thought, let me just share with you some general expressions about the problem of anti-Semitism. And I think in the course of the exchange, we can maybe talk more specifically about different countries and what's going on. But how to understand first the problem and then the challenge we have of effectively getting governments, because ultimately I think that's who must be responsible. How do you get governments to help address the problem? I sometimes will say we shouldn't generalize about anti-Semitism in Europe, but then I begin by generalizing. The reality is that it appears in different ways in different parts of Europe, perhaps based on historical experience, based on current demographics, and I think it's important to recognize there are differences, even if we have a general feeling that the problem has been, if not exploding, increasing, and increasing steadily. The OsCE had organized the very first conference on anti-Semitism in 2003. There were successive conferences, declarations, decisions. We're talking about an organization that encompasses now 57 countries here, the US and Canada, and in Europe. It is a cumbersome organization, but when they take decisions, they're taken by consensus, and there's a kind of expectation that countries will follow through. So we can see that there has been a greater recognition of the problem and tangible steps, at least begun by different countries. But what is the problem itself today in Europe? I think we see, one might say, anti-Semitism from the left, anti-Semitism from the right, anti-Semitism in some sort of centrist area, but only that. People will sometimes express the problem pointing to countries with a significant Jewish population and incidents that might occur. France, for example, as the largest Jewish community in Europe, has been the source of great concern in these recent years. But we also have taken note of anti-Semitism playing a role in countries where there are hardly any Jews. We've seen that over the years in Poland, for example, which then leads some people to say, well, we only have two situations where anti-Semitism presents itself. Those countries with Jews and those countries without Jews. So you can sort of look at this and almost feel overwhelmed that the problem itself, or at least the way it has presented itself, is almost universal. So what do we need to do to really look below the sort of superficial surface and ask, so what are we facing, or what are we facing today? And how do we know? And what can we do to get governments to address it? We have seen a growth in anti-Semitic incidents in parts of Europe that are clearly coming from segments of the Arab and Muslim population. We know that governments have difficulty understanding this, recognizing it, articulating it clearly, and frankly, with that, finding ways to deal with it. It has the added challenge that by not being clear on this, by not being outspoken in recognizing this problem, it adds to the anxiety that the Jews themselves feel. If you don't believe your government recognizes a problem, how can you have a sense of a certainty that they will try and deal with the problem? We, of course, have seen anti-Semitism coming from the left. We see anti-Semitism at times hiding behind an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel animus. We have seen it in different places, and most recently, I'm sure Karen will address it, we see it in the UK, where within the Labour Party, there are real challenges now to an anti-Semitism that is barely hiding behind anti-Zionist or anti-Israel rhetoric. It may be, in fact, that, rhetoric or language, but I think, as we all know, language has significance. It has led to a corrosive condition of Jewish communities where they themselves have their own doubts about security and safety. We see anti-Semitism on the right. Perhaps that's been the most constant form of anti-Semitism, certainly in Europe. We see growing support for right-wing, populist, nationalist parties. For all of them, anti-Semitism is part of the mix. It may not be as prevalent or first on the agenda as it once was, since antagonism toward immigrants, toward Muslims, has often fueled these parties. But it's there, and Jews recognize it, and it poses a continual problem and a continual source of frankly, of danger. Now, within that picture, we also have, I think, seen incidents, but more an environment in parts of Central and Eastern Europe that we weren't anticipating. There had been a process, we go back 25 years or so, as these countries established or restored democracy, and the very real challenge of confronting their own Holocaust history. And that matters. It matters because they never had the opportunity to do it clearly, critically, and objectively. At the end of the war, encompassed in the Baltic states, annexed by the Soviet Union. So it was only in the early 90s that one could even imagine a clear opportunity to look at this history, to be able to examine how individuals or governments at the time were also part of the German plan to murder the Jews of Europe. Collaborators, participants, bystanders. We had, I think, a unique period where governments were confronting this. We're beginning to deal with this in looking at the issue of anti-Semitism, the history of the Holocaust. We had issues dealing with property restitution and the like, helping these small Jewish communities in their own process of revival. We thought, I believe, that they knew how to, or were beginning to confront that history critically. But perhaps we were too sanguine. In many ways, those problems are still with us, and they matter. It's not only a matter of how you see history. If, for example, I cited merely as one case, you look at the Jewish community in Hungary, it's a Jewish community that's almost entirely composed of Holocaust survivors and their descendants. So when the government of Hungary begins to, or again, sort of looks to the fascist heroes, fascist leaders during the Second World War as figures to be honored today, where there appears to be in some of these countries an effort to distort the critical narrative of the Holocaust, it's not just a matter of history, but it really begins to undermine the sense of security, of safety, of comfort, of rootedness for these Jewish communities. So those are really some of the ways anti-Semitism presents itself. The challenge, and we can speak more in the exchange, is, well, what are governments doing about it? And what can we do to push those governments to address the problem? And here I think there are some very clear pragmatic successes, if you will. Governments now recognize at the very least the importance of addressing Jewish community security concerns, and we are learning that here in the United States. But there are still so many areas where we are pushing against headwinds to get governments to acknowledge anti-Semitism presents itself often in unique ways. It requires special attention and special efforts to deal with it, and that's simply not an easy process. So let me stop there, Ira, and thank you.
Karen.
Thank you. So firstly, just thank you to the, it's a real privilege for me to be at Georgetown University. I should say that I visited here when I was about 16 and bought the jumper, which you would refer to as a sweatshirt, I think, saying Georgetown University, and used to stroll around in it feeling very proud. This time I could buy one and feel like, it's more legitimate. But it's a real honor and privilege to be here, to speak at this conference. Huge thanks to Anna for inviting me and organizing this, and to Jocelyn, who's been dealing with my regular calls and emails to organize it. I really appreciate it. I've prepared some things that I want to say, but I am going to focus on the UK specifically. And some of what I will say, I will be assuming knowledge, but I will try to explain as much as I can, or I can be probed in the question and answer. But otherwise, I want to give you a flavor of what we're dealing with. I think that before I do so, the reason I need to talk about the UK is because there is a phenomenon, there is something going on that is perhaps not unfamiliar, but it's just surprising to all of us that we're dealing with it yet again. Before I do want to say something about Pittsburgh, because I feel I can't not. When the events of Pittsburgh unfolded, I was in the UK. That morning, I had been at Shul, at the synagogue, where we have a Jewish organization that provides security via volunteers. I joked with the security guy as I left. I'd been to primary school with him. And when I found out about what had happened in Pittsburgh, I texted him to thank him for keeping us safe that morning. But it shook me, and I think, around the globe, it shook all of us, because for me, a synagogue is the safe place in the same way that my home is. And the notion that somebody can come in and target Jews for being Jews in this day and age is still terrifying. I'm sure that, I'm not going to say anything different from anybody else in how devastating the events of Pittsburgh are. But I want to echo Anna's point, because it's something that for me is very much the thread of what is going on in the UK. Words matter, language matters, allowing an atmosphere of certain sentiments of hatred and poison to have oxygen, the permissive nature of that can lead to the extreme forms of hatred, and that can be violence, but it also can just be the targeting and persecution. And it's something we can't ignore, and certainly as well, something that Rabbi Baker said as well. I want to tell you briefly about the Holocaust Educational Trust to explain my role within the context of what's going on in the UK. As you heard, I ran the parliamentary group against anti-Semitism for a couple of years. And in that time, I was briefing MPs about events going on with regards to anti-Semitism somewhere else. It was in other countries. I was briefing them about issues perhaps they could raise in Parliament to bring attention to the cause. It was never, or very rarely, about things going on in the UK. And that is a massive shift if you look at the role of that parliamentary group and many of us in the community today. So it's something that's really struck me. And actually, Ira, your point about Durban, it's not that I've forgotten it, because we often say in the community it was my baptism of fire. I'd been in my professional life less than a year and represented the British Jewish community at what was the most horrendous atmosphere, and actually all the examples that you're giving of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel streaming onto anti-Semitism, that was there. And it wasn't unfamiliar, because I'd witnessed it in student politics. So I'd been involved in student politics at university. We were dealing with groups, I don't know, will you be familiar with Hizb ut-Tahrir? You will be like an extremist group who were gathering at our university under the guise of another organization, who are now proscribed in the UK. But at the time, they were allowed to be, existing, meeting, etc. But never in my dreams did I think I would be seeing it in real life, if you like, beyond my campus, that it was actually at the United Nations. And similarly, I didn't think I'd be seeing it within our politics in the UK. Just to say something about the Holocaust Educational Trust, our main work is teaching about the Holocaust in schools across the country. Very simple. We train teachers, we provide resources to use in the classroom, and we arrange for Holocaust survivors while they're still with us to give their testimony and while they're still able to travel the length and breadth of the country. We organize a specific project called Lessons from Auschwitz that takes 3,000 young people to visit Auschwitz from the UK for themselves, and they become our ambassadors. We have thousands of young people, a whole generation of young people who've met a survivor, who've learnt about the Holocaust, who visited Auschwitz and want to carry the legacy. I know it's something that Anna's familiar with from her previous role. That project is specifically funded by government. And yes, another example, I suppose, if you talk about a framework, there are some positives. There are things going on around the world and with certain governments where anti-Semitism is recognized as an issue, where education is recognized as important, and we shouldn't forget that. But the reason I mention that specifically as well is something that's really struck me over the past couple of years, and perhaps will come up in our conversations, is whilst I have a generation of young people who care so much about the survivors they've met, or who care so much about what happened during the Holocaust, when it comes to what is happening today, they're not quite sure still how to navigate it. They know that something perhaps isn't true. They know that they're seeing something on social media that is perhaps incitement, but they're still not quite sure how to address it. And I think that's a challenge for me, for my organization, but I think for all of us, that times have changed, and how do we address it? I should also mention, before going specifically on the politics in the UK, that as well as doing formal education, we are strongly of the view that you have to bring awareness of the past onto the national agenda and international agenda. Some highlights for me that I would mention are things like, I know that football isn't a big thing here, but we took the England football squad, for example, to Auschwitz. So famous footballers like Wayne Rooney or Steven Gerrard, I don't know if these are familiar at all to you, but they are people who then spoke about why it's important to remember the Holocaust. That's quite important for, disaffected young people in the UK who suddenly think, oh, this guy thinks it's important. We last year took Prince William and Kate, to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, to Stutthof, a concentration camp in Poland near Gdansk. It was the first time they'd visited a camp, and that really brought the spotlight on the cause. And we do things like that, as I say, for one reason, which is just to raise awareness, to always be sure that people understand that this is important, and to carry on for generation to generation. So let me now talk about the UK. I think it's astonishing when I say Labour and anti-Semitism. And when you said Labour, I was thinking, is anybody just thinking, are you sure that's what you mean, Labour, the Labour Party traditionally are, very much part of the Jewish community, and Labour were hand in hand, very much traditionally part of the same movement and ideals. And the notion that we are now in a situation where the Labour Party is the challenge, the people that we are tackling and having to confront, I would say, if not on a daily basis, pretty regular basis, it's relentless, is still astonishing when you take a step back. Then I'm now going to just talk through a number of things to give you a flavour, and I'm going to refer to my notes because it will be quicker that way. So Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party in 2015. Since he became the leader of the Labour Party, there has gradually become this atmosphere of open anti-Semitism, issues that seem to have free reign with no apparent consequences. So when there are incidents of anti-Semitism in a particular local Labour Party, the process of dealing with that individual and a normal sort of disciplinary process just is not forthcoming. And if it is forthcoming in the end, it's a very slow process with no real robust or immediate response. There's always been on the far left this familiar trait in respect to what you could call overpassionate views regarding the plight of Palestinians that tip into anti-Semitism. And that is something that we deal with. But we are actually now talking about a much more blatant form of anti-Semitism in the UK. Some of you may have been familiar with Ken Livingstone, a former London mayor, I'm not sure. So he talked about Hitler being a Zionist. He talked about Jews being collaborators with the Nazis. This is a former London mayor, a Labour, I think sweetheart would be too far, but somebody who'd been Labour all his life and regarded as one of their treasures, certainly not somebody I'd ever identified with, but some did, and wasn't disciplined. And it became a real saga in the UK. Another big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, Jackie Walker, referred to the Jews being the chief financiers of the slave trade. Again, not rejected, not slammed down, not regarded as a challenge. We've got Jewish MPs constantly being subjected to horrific abuse on social media, sometimes physical threats, many being targeted for deselection, i.e. to not be able to stand again in their local constituency, or votes of no confidence, either if they're Jewish or if they're MPs who've championed the cause of fighting anti-Semitism. take a moment again to think about that. So people who are saying it's wrong to fight, we need to fight anti-Semitism, are being regarded as people who are trying to derail Jeremy Corbyn. They're trying to derail the leader. And that's all this is about. It's not about the anti-Semitism. It's just about trying to undermine the leadership. This is the new prism through which it is looked through. We're seeing Holocaust denial and distortion, tropes being invoked of, Jewish bankers, Rothschild, conspiracy theories, Stars of David imposed on various people's head on social media. And, when you see all of this, it's shocking when I'm saying it, but I think some of us are becoming, is inure the right word? We're becoming so used to it. And at first, it was the question of, well, a political leader, whatever your actual views, it's your job to say something and do something very clear and to say there's a line, it's been crossed, this isn't okay. And it didn't happen from the leader of the Labour Party, a leader who has links with a man called Stephen Sizer, who shares various anti-Semitic material and regards 9/11 as a conspiracy, developed by the Jews. Links with Paul Eisen, a Holocaust denier, who also founded the Deir Yassin Remembered group. Speaks regularly, or did speak regularly, on the Iranian state-sponsored Press TV, which for Holocaust Memorial Day this year, its theme was, has the Holocaust been exploited to oppress others? And then there was this mural, which I think I can show you. This is where my technical phobia, steps in. A mural which I think you would recognize as anti-Semitic, that was something that Jeremy Corbyn had liked on Facebook. And for the first time, it came to his door. Let's see what happens here.
In terms, when it comes to anti-Semitism, it's Jewish people who have the first right to call out anti-Semitism. So how did you feel when one of your MPs, a Jewish MP, Margaret Hodge, looked you in the eye and called you a racist and anti-Semite?
I completely and utterly reject the idea that any kind of racist or any kind of...
How did you feel?
The matter with Margaret Hodge is closed.
One of the reasons she may have thought, there's a series of events over the summer, and this is your opportunity now to kind of, as it were, explain what happened and explain to people why what happened happened. The first thing that many people will remember is this mural, now notorious mural, on an East London wall. What did you first think when you saw that?
Well, I was worried about the idea of murals being taken down, and I had my thoughts were about that, and I was kind of worried that the idea that somebody put a mural up should be taken down, and I sort of asked some questions about that, and actually the mural was taken down, and I was perhaps too hasty in my judgment on that, but it has been taken down, and I'm glad it has.
I would just have thought it would take about 1 second to look at that and say that is an anti-Semitic trope there. The Holocaust Education Trust said this mural was blatantly anti-Semitic, using images commonly found in anti-Semitic propaganda. It is impossible not to notice.
It also has other symbols in it as well, doesn't it?
But
on Freemasonry.
Do you not think it's strange that you didn't immediately think that's dodgy?
I was concerned about the idea of taking down public murals, and I'm pleased to say it was taken down.
And do you now find it anti-Semitic?
I think it should never have been put up.
So that was a case of, as it were, you didn't perhaps look closely enough at something.
Okay, we'll stop there, but you get the gist. I think, am I right in thinking if you saw that image, you would recognize anti-Semitic tropes? I think, to me, I thought it was obvious straight away, but you begin to question yourself, thinking maybe it's just because we've worked in this field for so long, we know it, right? And this, by the way, that wasn't his response when it happened, which is in April. This is his response in September, so months later, when he absolutely could have reflected on it and thought, actually, this is anti-Semitic. But I'm going to carry on. But because this mural came to his door, and I'm very aware of time, so give me an indication when I've got 1 minute left.
1 minute.
Oh, God. Okay, I'm going to have to speed through. We as a community led a rally called Enough is Enough. It actually came about because I called the leader of the Jewish community after that mural and said, we've got to do something. We can't just be a community that is silent in the face of this. We have to stand up, and particularly, history has to say, record that we had a voice. And so thousands of people gathered in Parliament Square, right by Big Ben, saying enough is enough. Because of time, I'm now going to go very quickly through if there are any other things. Things that I should also mention. So a leading member of, unions are a big part of the Labour Party. The chief guy of the leading union, Unite, called anti-Semitism mood music. At one of the Labour Party conferences, there was actually a discussion of the Holocaust, yes or no, as if there was a discussion about whether it happened or not. It just quite incredible. And then over the summer, some of you you'll be familiar with IRA, but there's another IRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And this has a definition of anti-Semitism. It's adopted by 31 countries. Over 100 councils in the UK have adopted it. The Crown Prosecution Service, judicial system have adopted it as a way to understand what anti-Semitism is. The only group who wanted to debate what anti-Semitism was the group who are guilty of not doing anything about anti-Semitism, the Labour Party. And over the summer, for 3 months, there were debates about what is the meaning of anti-Semitism and whether the Labour Party should be devising their own definition. It was eventually adopted, but the moot point was about whether if you call Israel a racist state, whether that's anti-Semitic. The result of which was, even though it was passed, the next day, I think we've got images, but there were, I don't know if somebody maybe can help sort of fast forward so that we just see the image. Posters, there you go, Israel is a racist endeavour on the bus stops in London. So Jew baiting, it's regarded as. They're doing it deliberately to get a response. Finally, I do want to just say one other thing, if that's okay. Polls, because I think it's important just to be aware of them. A poll of British Jews said 85% think Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic. Amongst the wider public, 39% think so. That was in August. In September, 40% of British Jews would seriously consider emigrating if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister. I think that's quite telling, as just to understand where we are in the UK. I'm not talking about the rest of Europe, but I think the final comment I would just say is, even I've given you a real quick sort of point of view. There are other images there as well that are just of various things that we get attacked for. I'm accused of being in the hands of the Israeli government, that we're telling Zionist lies when we talk about the Holocaust, and it goes on and on. But there are decent people. And despite the fact that I'm painting a picture of it's all doomed, there are some brilliant MPs who are standing up for the Jewish community and standing up against anti-Semitism. Across the country, there are people actually who are appalled by what they're seeing. And there are people who, irrelevant of if they understand anti-Semitism or not, do regard the incompetence of the political leader of dealing with it as a real sort of a challenge in itself. Like, why is it that he can't see it as a problem? You know all too well that leaders need to lead, leaders have to take responsibility, and leaders have to say when something is or isn't okay. And if they don't, in a sense, they're giving a green light or something like this, a license to thrive. That's how we feel things are a bit in the UK. And the question for us is, what does that mean for us in the future? And no doubt we'll talk about it. I'm sorry if I've overrun, so.
Well, thank you, Karen. I was struck in the last few days looking through the English language press in the UK, the Jewish press, etc., that a local labor council was brought before them to condemn what happened in Pittsburgh, and by a strong margin they said, no, we're not going to condemn it.
Yeah.
Hard to believe. Now, Benjamin.
Thank you. I want to thank the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University for inviting me, Dr. Anya Sommer-Schneider and Jocelyn Flores for their tremendous work in pulling together this conference. Ira quickly told me before the session that I would have about 3 hours to speak, so we'll have a short pause for lunch, and I know this audience has a bottomless level of patience for discussing anti-Semitism in Western Europe. I tend to, in terms of listening to what Karen just said, I'm excessively pessimistic about Europe. My departure point will be continental Europe, Western Europe, and the future of Jewry. I think the trend right now is highly disturbing, and I'm of the opinion that Jews in Europe should consider aliyah to Israel, to immigrate to Israel, or to a safe Anglo country. There are some out there, Canada, the United States, Australia, because European governments, again, Western European governments are severely incompetent and incapable of protecting their small Jewish communities. France, of course, is a bit of an exception because it has about 500,000 Jews. I say this with the background of someone who's been living in Berlin, Germany for most of my adult life now, the last 16 years, and reporting and analyzing on modern anti-Semitism on the continent and to some extent in the United Kingdom for different Israeli outlets mainly, but also American papers as well. I think to understand, or at least the key takeaway I've had in terms of understanding Western European anti-Semitism is there was a famous quote from an Israeli psychoanalyst in the 80s that's still well known, Zivi Rex, who said about Germany in the 80s, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Now, he said that with biting sarcasm and irony, but the idea was the German response to the Shoah filled Germans, and I know I'm engaging in sweeping generalizations, so put all this in scary quotes because this topic is enormously complex and I only have now probably 8 minutes left, is the German response in this case was to fill Germans with pathological guilt about the crimes of the National Socialists. So in response to that, there was an increase of anti-Semitism. This is not my theory, it's a theory of two German Jewish Marxists, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who actually worked for the American Jewish Committee in the 40s. Very distinguished philosophers and their idea was this is the new guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism that's kicked in. So that prevailed in Germany and Austria, one could argue, well into the 60s. And then my take is it merged into an Israel bashing anti-Semitism after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel flexed its muscles and defeated Arab armies in a stunning victory. And now what we have, and this is sort of my theory that's largely built on this idea from Horkheimer and Adorno, is the Western Europeans will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. So you have a pan-Western European phenomenon where, again, this is meant to be sarcastic, but the idea is Western Europeans are filled with guilt about their government's complicity during the Holocaust, and they turn to Israel, which is now viewed in the phrase of one famous French historian as the collective Jew in the world, and turn Israel into a human punching bag. Israel, in this case, represents the European Jew of the National Socialist period. And I don't know how else to explain the intense preoccupation with Israel in Western European media, government, including their policy decisions. If you can provide me, and I've asked scholars and I've asked journalists in Germany and politicians, what is it about Israel that gets the blood boiling so much in Europe? Why are you so triggered, to use that term that's popular in the academy in the United States, when Israel's mentioned, but not triggered when there are other forms of repression, for example, the 500,000 people who have been killed in Syria. I don't see any mass rallies taking place across Europe to address that mass murder by Iran, Hezbollah, Assad, and Putin. So I haven't heard any plausible explanation. Hence, I think this idea of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism that feeds into Israel right now provides the best sort of sociological framework to understand what's happening in Europe and the contemporary expression of anti-Semitism. Europe is largely trying to manage anti-Semitism right now. And that's, I think, a false way of trying to handle it. You can't manage anti-Semitism. The best you can do right now, in my view, is to approach it as a counterterrorism project, and Europe's unwilling to do that. I think anti-Semitism definitions are important. Don't get me wrong. I think defining what anti-Semitism is, the 3D definition, all these definitions are fine. Holocaust education, all very important. And in Germany, on the other hand, with the increase of Holocaust education, you've seen an increase of anti-Semitism. I don't know how to explain that. It's beyond my cognitive abilities, but it's another puzzle. The most recent study in Germany, which was commissioned by the German Bundestag, the federal parliament, showed that last year that 40% of Germans hold a modern anti-Semitic view, namely Israel is the equivalent of the Hitler movement, these types of parallels where you want to purge your guilt or your parents or grandparents or great-great-parents' guilt by equating the democratic Jewish state with the Hitler movement. And how do you do that? Again, well, they're as bad as the Nazis. They're treating the Palestinians in the same way as the Wehrmacht or, as the Nazis did. These types of parallels. So you have extraordinarily high levels of anti-Semitism, and I would add it right now, extraordinary high levels of anti-Americanism, because the two are interrelated. I just want to check my notes here. How am I in time?
About 2 or 3 minutes.
Oh, God, what am I going to do? I wanted to go into the German parties. Well, let me, one other phenomenon that I've noticed, and I'm just throwing out concepts here. We can probe these concepts, as Karen said during the Q&A, because good questions are better than good answers, and I'm not really providing any answers, is what you see in Germany, and I would also argue in Western Europe, is there's anti-Semitism without anti-Semites. I think this is actually a concept that the American Jewish Committee developed many years ago. This notion of, well, if you point out a human being as an anti-Semite, the German society objects. Of course, if it's a neo-Nazi somewhere in the East, there won't be any objection. But if it's a radical Islamist who's part of the Iranian regime and runs an Islamic center in Hamburg, and there is, and organizes a Al-Quds Day demonstration calling for the destruction of Israel, there'll be huge debates about whether this is anti-Semitism. So again, this problem of anti-Semitism without anti-Semites, and not the inability to personalize it, to identify who is an anti-Semite, is ubiquitous in my view. How to combat anti-Semitism? I take a different take than Andy, well, it's somewhat of a Karen's approach. The Community Security Trust is the arm of the Jewish community that protects Jewish organizations, correct? That's an interesting concept. I like that because you have a grassroots organization where Jews are protecting themselves. That's worked well in Italy, for example, where Italian Jews have armed themselves. So in a sense, it can't hurt for European Jews to have sort of some type of Second Amendment. I know that sounds controversial because the Second Amendment is controversial for many in light of what's happened in the United States over the years. But if you look at an article, for example, by Michael Ledeen in Tablet, the online Jewish magazine, Michael Ledeen's an expert in Italian fascism and Italian Jewry. He's written about how the Italian Jewish community, a tiny Jewish community, has self-organized and armed themselves. They don't have problems with anti-Semites. So that might be one lesson to draw. Obviously, the British example is very good. I'm skeptical about depending on state governments for security. Obviously you have to, but they have a horrible track record. Unless you turn synagogues into fortresses, like in France and Germany, that's helped. But still, we've experienced so many Islamic animated terrorism attacks that you need a self-organized Jewish community that's involved in self-defense to stop the rising lethal anti-Semitism in Germany. And I think that's the key. When we discuss all these forms of anti-Semitism, right-wing, left-wing, guilt offensiveness, there's so many mutations. The key factor to understanding what's animating anti-Semitism is the eliminatory quality, the lethal quality. The end result of anti-Semitism is death, murder, killing. And that's what I think European societies fail to internalize, the eliminatory quality of this. Germany is a key example. 950 Hezbollah members operate in Germany. Germany's refused to outlaw the lethal terroristic organization Hezbollah, its so-called political wing, and that group spreads eliminatory anti-Semitism, at least its ideology in Germany. So I'm very skeptical about European governments willing to combat anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. We'll open up for some questions. One of the things that we did always at the State Department in trying to triage, because there are so many problems in the world, there are literally dozens of countries we were tracking, is trying to prioritize what Jewish communities were under the most pressure, what were the most dangerous forms of anti-Semitism in a given country, and we prioritize countries all the time, and frankly, we change those priorities periodically. I'd like to ask each of the panelists, I know, Karen, you're particularly focused on the UK, but you have a general knowledge of what's going on in Europe. which Jewish communities, which countries are you most concerned about? One in particular, but if you want to give us two, and why are you concerned about that? Andy, you want to start?
Sure. I'll give you two. France and Germany. France, because it's the largest Jewish community in Europe, 500,000 Jews. France, because the sense of security, and we see it in survey work done by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, indicate that there's a significant percentage of French Jews who have thought about emigrating. By the way, thinking about leaving is certainly not the same as leaving, but it suggests a level of anxiety that's disturbing. Compounded in France, I believe in any case, is this bedrock French principle of laïcité or secularity, which has really contributed to the problem, meaning that it becomes all the more difficult to speak about what Jews experience in a singularity way. The notion somehow all are French citizens, we can't identify people by religion. I had the occasion meeting with education officials in the ministry, sharing with them concerns I heard from French Jewish leaders. Jewish kids were leaving the public schools because of being harassed. I was told by these ministry officials, well, we don't know that. And in a way they didn't, because they will not identify people by religion. Anyway, I cite France. I cite Germany for something different, and I have a different view of things than Benny does, but that's the nature of who we are, I think. I first spent time in Germany in the early 1980s. A Jewish community perhaps numbering around 30,000, very much in the shadows. If you talked with them, I would say the common story you heard was, well, we're on our way out. This is a temporary stay in Germany. Today we're talking about a significant number of Jews, I don't know, 150,000 or more, depending on how we identify them. I can recall tough discussions in the early 90s that we at AJC had with Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany, when effectively the German government opened the door to Jews from the former Soviet Union, when the Israeli government and the Israeli ambassador in Germany was arguing strenuously they shouldn't do it. At the fall of communism, Jews could go to Israel, and the idea that Germany, for its history and other reasons, should now become a home for these Jews was really viewed not just skeptically, but almost as an outrage. But the reality is you have a real Jewish community today. You have real numbers. You have Jewish institutions. By the way, you have all the problems that go with that. But none of us in the early 80s would have predicted there was much or any future for Jewish life in Germany. So now the question becomes, and I think what Benny has described in terms of the environment, general attitudes which are not positive toward Jews, but by the way, I think that's one of the real distinctions between here in the United States and in much of Europe. I've focused on governments, and I think the reason is governments can do things, and maybe the attitudes of government leaders, or at least what they are able to express, is more knowledgeable and understanding. But it's true, it doesn't translate down to the larger population. So if in a way you've had a kind of Jewish renaissance, who would have imagined that there would be a real living Jewish community in light of that history in Germany today? It becomes all the more, I think, critical to wonder and to be concerned about what its future holds, particularly, and with this I'll stop, Germany took in a huge number of migrants, refugees from the Middle East, from North Africa, from countries where there's very, very deep mainstream anti-Israel, anti-Jewish attitudes, and whether it's going to be able to deal with this population and the already established population of people from Muslim countries is still very much in question.
Karen.
I don't have much to add because I was going to say France, mainly from talking to people, I think actually to Jewish people in France, I agree with that point of people can say in a poll that they'd be thinking of leaving, and it's very different to leaving. But I think the number of incidents that we hear about quite regularly in France that are quite brutal. There was the murder of a Holocaust survivor, Mireille Know, in her home, because she was Jewish. But there were various others, children coming home from their Jewish schools or whatever else. It seems to feel the most physically threatened.
And you put obviously a high value on violences if you have violence in a community.
Well, we had this conversation only recently, the community leadership in the UK. I think we feel it's a fragile time for Jews around the world. I think we feel it's different in different places in terms of how it manifests itself. But I think it's a fragile time. And I do feel like Pittsburgh is it's a bit of a sit back and take stock moment. But I think in the UK, I think at the moment, we are, for January to June, the first 6 months of 2018, it's the second highest record of anti-Semitic incidents since recording by the Community Security Trust. But when we say incident, that isn't all physical assault. That can be abuse, verbally or whatever else. So that's worrying. But I see still a future for British Jewry.
Well, I will not talk about Britain, even though I did my master's work there, because I simply cannot understand Britain, even though I studied there. Okay, I've spent years trying to understand the UK, but I'm still clueless about it. It's interesting in Germany. I'll just talk a little about Germany and Austria. First, Germany. There's been an increase in Aliyah numbers, small increase, 105 to 171 since 2013 until the present. It rose. So there's an uptick. It's not much, but I've gotten calls and emails from German Jews who present their stories to me as a reporter for the Jerusalem Post about what children in public schools in Germany have experienced. Many of you probably saw that video. I mean, this is, to back up, I suspect the number of Aliyah will increase in Germany. The population in Germany, German Jewish population, is largely an older population. So again, the renaissance of German Jewry, I think one has to put a question mark over that. This was where I slightly disagree with Andy in terms of where it's tending, because many of the Jews from the former Soviet Union who emigrated were older, already had children. Many of those children sort of go back, commute between Israel and Germany. Many of you, I'm sure, saw the incident in Berlin where a Syrian refugee was whipping an Israeli Arab who's wearing a kippah. There was a video that circulated that garnered headlines and drew a lot of attention to anti-Semitism from migrants and refugees who are now in Germany. That's a huge problem that you could devote days of a conference to it, because of the million-plus migrants and refugees are in Germany, most of whom are from Muslim-majority countries. And as Andy mentioned, these countries are steeped in Jew hatred. So you're adding a factor into German society that, in my view, will lead to a recipe for political and social implosion. I just don't see any other way out of this because of the high levels of anti-Semitism among the non-Muslim population in Germany, combined with this new factor. I would add, in terms of Germany, that what I find disturbing about the role of the Holocaust is the German government, to its credit, criticized and condemned Bishop Williamson a number of years ago, who denied the Holocaust and urged the Pope at the time to condemn him. But when Iranian figures step on German soil and deny the Holocaust, suddenly the German government is painfully silent. Ali Larijani, the current head of the Iranian parliament, denied the Holocaust in 2009 at the Munich Security Conference. No one in Merkel's government decided to prosecute him or condemn him, or urged the supreme leader of Iran to condemn Iranian Holocaust denial. A year before, his brother, Mohammad Larijani, who's the head of the Iranian Human Rights, putting that in scary quotes, Council, denied the Holocaust at a German foreign ministry-sponsored event. zero condemnation from the German government. He denied the Holocaust, by the way, within feet of the Holocaust Memorial in the center of the Berlin. So how do you explain this disconnect? How do you explain that Germany is now working overtime to bust US sanctions on Iran? Germany is Iran's most important trade partner. Iran, of course, is the largest state sponsor of Holocaust denial, lethal anti-Semitism, and terrorism. Shouldn't Merkel have a responsibility to combat that? When she was in Israel in October, she rebuffed the Israeli government's request to join American sanctions, which kicked in on Monday. These are questions that I think one needs to grapple with, and I don't see that public discussion taking place. Quickly on Austria, and I'll end here. Austria is also a very weird situation because you have an extreme right-wing party, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, in the government. Israel won't meet with this party because it's filled with Nazis. And the vice chancellor of the party, Heinz Christian Strache, is, spent time as a neo-Nazi. So Austria's never had sort of a left-wing anti-Semitism problem, in contrast to Germany, where left-wing anti-Semitism is ubiquitous. Austria's always had this right-wing anti-Semitism problem, and it's been largely ignored in terms of what's happening in Austria, which one should keep its eye on.
Benjamin, I'm going to follow up and just ask real quick. I'm assuming by your answer that you worry most about the German and Austrian communities and the threat to anti-Semitism to those communities.
Well, I worry. Austria is a tiny Jewish community, 5,000. Yes, I worry about what's happening in those communities. I think I worry because Germany is the economic engine of Europe and can help can formulate policy on a European-wide level. For example, if the Germans said tomorrow, Angela Merkel, the chancellor, wakes up and said, I want to outlaw all of Hezbollah, a lethal anti-Semitic organization that's killed Israelis, Jews, Europeans on European soil, right? Burgas in 2013. A Hezbollah Iranian attack killed 5 Israelis, including their Muslim Bulgarian bus driver. People forget to acknowledge that, including in Bulgaria, where I've been a number of times, and injured 32 others. Why not? Germany is in a position to help not only German Jews and Austrian Jews, but European Jews in general by saying, we want Hezbollah proscribed as a terrorist organization. I would imagine the Brits would follow, because there's been some talk in the Tory party, even though they still haven't done it.
Yeah.
And I would imagine the French and other countries would follow the German lead. The Germans aren't taking the lead, and that's disturbing.
This could be the right thing to do. I'm not sure it's going to change the condition of Jews in Europe. And if I could say a word about Austria, sure. I think Austria illustrates the complicated picture you have. Yeah, you have a coalition government with essentially a party that was founded by old Nazis that's problematic. Even the Jewish community in Austria will say, we won't meet with ministers from that party. And at the same time, you have a chancellor, a young guy, Sebastian Kurz. Whatever the reason, some may view it more cynically than others, has really tried to champion efforts to fight anti-Semitism. At this time, Austria holds the presidency of the European Union. It has been pushing actively in Brussels to have an EU decision, a EU declaration of the European Council condemning anti-Semitism with very specific calls for measures that different EU member states should be taking. So you want to be supportive of that, even as you recognize the complications of this new coalition government.
One of the things I'm frustrated by is there is so much material here that we won't get to, and we're going to open it up soon, a few minutes to the audience. Before we do that, Karen, one of the things that I'm always very interested in is every conference I ever go to on anti-Semitism. I was just in Moscow for a conference on Russian anti-Semitism. Everybody talks about education. One of the pieces, we'd all agree that security is a piece, education's a piece, there's all kinds of other things, whether the working definition, but rarely do you ever hear anybody say, hey, if you're going to do education, education, we have all kinds of Holocaust education throughout the continent. Many times it's clear it doesn't work. have you, in your work, really been able to really kind of get a good handle on, if we're going to spend money on education, what kind of education really will deal with this problem, and what types probably don't, and are they also country specific? Are they culturally specific?
It's a good question. I think that the first thing I would say is we've always said that teaching about the Holocaust is definitely not a panacea to dealing with anti-Semitism. You're learning actually about something in the past. Now, however, even though it's a history subject, if a young person, having heard from a survivor, understood how the Holocaust came about, visited Auschwitz, is not then sensitized a bit more to the world that they live in, and their eyes are not opened more, then there's something going wrong. But what you do with that is then the next question. But I can only speak, for example, in the UK, the Holocaust is on the national curriculum. Anti-Semitism isn't on a curriculum specifically. Schools will do what they want in terms of the amount of time they spend on a particular subject to a degree. They have to tick a box. Some teachers will spend hours, some will spend, over a period of weeks, some will do it in a week. And we do our best to reach all of them, but we're not in control of them. They are their own masters. But I do think there is a piece of work here that I alluded to earlier about even the most passionate young people who do get why it's important to remember the past, because we want a more tolerant, future, and that we want to fight hate from wherever it comes. Even they are, I believe, struggling with how to deal with what is actually a new age, because social media is a big part of the spreading of anti-Semitism. There is also an element of, you can have a political rally where anti-Semitism may be espoused, and if people don't say anything or if people are with it, well, we can all be outraged afterwards. There can be a dinner party where people can casually make comments, where you feel uncomfortable to intervene. All those things are true, but on social media, there is more of an echo chamber. Somebody can say something who used to say it, in their dark room where nobody ever, they didn't interact with anybody else. And now loads of people respond, they think their views are valid, and it spreads and it's shared, and it rises. I think education is key. Something actually that recently happened in the UK is we've had various conversations with government about, on reflection, I regard what's happened over the past couple of years in the UK as a crisis. At the time, I don't think we regarded it as a crisis. We were just dealing with it day by day, trying to fight what was coming at us on a daily basis. But actually, we should have created the equivalent, if you like, of a war room, and thought about what is our rebuttal unit doing when myths are being shared, how are we dispelling them, what positive work can be going on in schools to explain why certain language and certain tropes are offensive. They don't necessarily relate it to Nazi propaganda. They just can't see it. And I think we have to accept that we are all passionate about this issue. We care about it and we know about it. Some people, it's not that they don't care, but they don't necessarily know and they don't have the tools. And I would say that's a large part of our population, and we have to do more.
One final question for the panel, then we'll open it up. We haven't had a chance to talk a lot about Eastern Europe. We talked a little bit, Hungary, Poland. But we have this rise, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, of right-wing, xenophobic, extreme right-wing parties, many of which have neo-Nazi roots, but also often are sympathetic to Israel. And actually, in some cases, like the National Front, want to reach out to Jewish voters. It's a validation for them, and say they do, and say, look, we've got a common enemy in these refugees and Muslim populations in Europe. So we've seen, in some cases, Israel responding that we want to have nothing to do with these people. Other times, we see in places like Hungary and Poland, where there is a lot of work with the government. What should the Jewish community's response and Israel's response be, not that we can tell the government of Israel what to do, to these various right-wing, extreme right-wing, with movements that have anti-Semitic backgrounds, if they're not necessarily saying it immediately now? Any one of you.
I'll start. I mean, we need to make some differentiation. I don't think, for example, while Marine Le Pen and the National Front in France would like to kind of, in some ways, kosher itself, whether that's with contacts in Israel or, for that matter, Marine Le Pen some years ago wanted to come here and visit the Holocaust Museum. I don't think it has had much impact. I don't think you see in Israel or mainstream Jewish organizations sort of opening the door, and you have a very strong position on the part of CRIF, on the part of the institutional Jewish community in France, not to have contact. I think it's a much more challenging question when you look at places like Austria, or for that matter, like Hungary. So with regard to Austria, and I mentioned before, you have a real tension right now where you had a Jewish community that from the beginning was outspoken in saying, after the elections in Austria, the Conservative Party, Kurz's party, should not form a coalition government with the Freedom Party, even though it was signaling it was going to do just that. And it did that. And it has a funny situation at the moment. In the spring, I was talking with the leader of the Austrian Jewish community, asked him how things were now with this government. He said, we have a perfect relationship with 50% of the government. Well, it's a funny situation. For the moment, maybe it works. Clearly, there's a lot of pressure in Israel on the part of the Austrian government to say, open up here. Look at the positive things we're doing, our relationship with Israel. So ease up on the criticism. And there is some pressure. And I think it's bearing fruit. I mean, I think it's the sort of idea of full ostracizing of it is diminishing. In Hungary, we're really not talking about, I mean, there is a right-wing nasty party, Jobbik. It's not part of the government. But you have a government that's flirted with Holocaust revisionism, distortion, playing on Hungary's Christian roots, which doesn't necessarily make Jews feel comfortable. There are complicated issues about dealing with Holocaust history with certain high-profile memorials, museums. But we'll say there's a good relationship with Israel. We're strongly supporting Israel in the EU, and they are doing things that Israel quite appreciates. So you really do have a tension here between, again, Hungary has the largest Jewish community in Central Europe, so a local Jewish community that is troubled by things. You had the anti-Soros campaign as part of the election in recent months, and this was a Fidesz policy. So you could have actually the Jewish community in Hungary saying, you know, this really is, if not by design, by effect, an anti-Semitic campaign. But you can have in Israel, the government, the prime minister saying it's not. So I think that points to some of the problems, complications we see.
One thing I would say, and Anna, I think you probably are more of an expert on this than I am, but with regards to Poland, certainly something that we struggled a lot with was when there was this new law being proposed where discussion about the Holocaust would be stifled. You basically, the threat was that you couldn't talk about Polish complicity during the Holocaust. Strong representations were made by Holocaust institutions and leaders from across the world, including it being raised in the British Parliament and elsewhere. Yet there were other conversations of, you know, between the Israeli delegation and the Polish government where it's all fine. It was, you know, for us, and you know, there are certain points where there are principles that are beyond, you know, reproach. You can't go there, and it's confusing, and what's the expression? It dilutes the strength of the issue and of the message. Eventually, this has been resolved to a degree, but I think there are times where there is a challenge. But I completely accept as well that there are political, nation upon nation negotiation and engagement on all sorts of things. But I think with Poland, actually, that was a really strong example where things went horribly wrong for a long time, and it led to all sorts of confusion. And soon, it could have led to the Polish government being able to get away with it, which would have been problematic.
Benjamin.
Well, I think the Israeli government is put in a vice on its relations to some of these Eastern European countries who are practicing Holocaust distortion or Holocaust revisionism, as well as other unsavory anti-Jewish things like the anti-Soros campaign in Hungary. On the other hand, Hungary was one of, I think, 2 countries in the European Union that opposed the EU's demarcation of Jewish products from the disputed territories in the West Bank in 2015. To my understanding, that was reported in the press. Greece was the other country. The EU passed this measure saying EU countries can label Israeli products or products from these disputed territories of the West Bank. And that, of course, was viewed as an anti-Semitic measure that resembled the "don't buy from Jews" measures of the Hitler movement in the 30s. Because Israel's products were the only country that were penalized in connection with the territorial dispute. The other country, by the way, was the Greek government, which is a left-wing government. So it's and there are reasons for this happening, but Hungary actually, took an interesting position. In terms of, I think the problem is Israel is always viewed as, and this is where the double standards notion comes in, is viewed as on this higher ethical plane, right? That's why I don't like when Israel says the government, well, we have the most moral army in the world. Actually, you have an army like every other army in the world. It's not the most, it's not the least, it's an army. And I think that's how Israel should probably try to approach its relations with these Eastern European governments. Right now, Israel does not have diplomatic relations, or will not meet with high-level ministers from the Freedom Party in Austria. They refuse to meet with Le Pen in France, but they do meet with Hungary and Poland and other countries, as we know, highly advanced capitalist countries, Western liberal democracies, meet with unsavory governments, unsavory regimes. We know that from the history of the United States and other countries. So I think one has to approach this with great caution in terms of Israel's role. And Israel's not, one should be wary about elevating Israel on this sort of moral superior plane, because then we get into the business of, well, the Israelis are above the fray, and that's why we should treat them differently.
Let's now go to the audience. We'll start on this side, and we'll go back and forth. This lady right here in the second row.
Thanks for the panel. My name is Li Yang. If I understand that Semitism is not good, and you want to fight against it, but first, from your title, I wonder why we are in the United States, but you choose a European as a title rather than an issue in the United States. Is there any anti-Semitism that we should work on? And why Semitism? What people say about against other race, or is this really against some kind of characteristic rather than by race? So whether the Jewish is doing something that other people don't like, and what do they say, and how do we prevent it? You mentioned a lot about education or violence, but why do they use those approach? Education for what? You had to say importance of how to resolve it. If any issues that is not good, unjust, or violence, or racism, or abuse, we got to tackle those issues rather than choose something that's so kind of abstract that people don't really know what issues are. So could you be able to tackle those more close issues that we can really understand? So how do we, us government or us people or us civic organization really tackle those rather than just use some kind of abstract Semitism to refer the whole thing about Jewish issues. I don't think this problem is not Jewish issues. It's something characteristic about what people are doing, whether it's a small group of Jewish doing by some kind of unfair approach, or even some other people doing. Just like United States, they have a lot of abuse, misconduct, and racial profiling. By that, not just black or brown.
May I ask if you've got a question for
the
one
whole
of
panel?
The whole panel? Okay.
That you understand.
Okay. I think the
on
panel could address. Anybody want to try to address more than one issue? I think.
I think there's always the question of how singular is the problem of anti-Semitism and how much of it is part of a kind of universal concern about racism and intolerance, xenophobia, and the like. And I think clearly in efforts to combat anti-Semitism, I don't think you can separate it from this larger focus. But I think much of what we're discussing, and I think was the goal of the seminar, is to talk about some of the sort of singular or more unique aspects of anti-Semitism. It defies, I think, these normal categories, and that is probably why at least the discussion has been more focused in that regard.
And I would say a couple of things. I think the first thing is it would be more comfortable for us to assume that the reason people hate a certain group of people is because that group of people have done something wrong. But actually, the point about anti-Semitism and the point about racism and hate in general is that there's no foundation for the view. It's because there's something that, I can't explain it, but somehow people have become influenced and understand they want to scapegoat in some way a group of people. But I think it's important that we're not looking to apportion blame. Anti-Semitism might sound abstract. Actually, in the UK, something we've done over and over because of the situation we've had with the Labour Party is to say that anti-Semitism is a form of racism. If you replaced some of the things that we were dealing with from Jew to Muslim or Jew to black, whatever it is, people would be outraged. But because it was about Jews, because it was anti-Semitism, it somehow didn't chime, it somehow didn't get through. That in itself is a challenge in terms of education, breaking down, as you say, the abstract.
I would just add, there's a clinically insane view that permeates the intelligentsia in Europe that whenever Israel engages in self-defense measures against Hamas rocket attacks from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, Hamas is an EU-US classified terrorist organization, that Israel's measures to stop the missile attacks flying into Israel's southern territory causes an increase in anti-Semitism or causes protests, and that leads to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism causes anti-Semitism. It's not Israel's self-defense measures. And I think that notion needs to be debunked, and it's very, very difficult to do that in terms of pedagogy, because the press is and so many politicians are so immersed in this obsolete view. Yeah.
We have a question on this side. No? Then this gentleman in the third row. And then we'll go back to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm an adjunct professor here at Georgetown who teaches a course on corruption and security, which has nothing really to do with this subject. But I also spent the last few years making a movie about a survivor in the Czech Republic. And when we showed the movie in Prague to a Czech audience, not to a Jewish audience at all, this is a movie that talks about the Holocaust, Terezin, but also goes on to the show trials of Jews in the early 50s under communism and anti-Semitism under communism. And the response was a completely numbed silence. We've shown the film in many countries, completely different reaction. This was weird. And when we asked about it, and we asked people in the audience about it, they said, we had no idea. This is a part of our history that's never taught in our schools. This is a part of our history that we, and I'm talking mostly about people who were in their 30s and early 40s, had no idea about. And I'm very concerned, as I hear you, and you talk about people to emigrate, and we're hearing all of the very great contributions you made. I'm very concerned that much of the educational outreach is not necessarily to the right people. It is inclusive, of course, of all the right people. But there are many people in many countries who are just not aware of their own history. And I think a movie is one way of trying to help to do that. But I'd like your response to that, because I was quite shocked by just the ignorance. Thank you.
Karen?
First of all, I am not shocked, if that makes sense, because I think that's right. I think that a lot of people are not necessarily informed about their own history. Something under the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, this global sort of, lots of countries are part of this global umbrella where they share good practice of Holocaust education. And what often happens is you'll have a leading country like, the US, or it would be Germany, or Israel would link, or the UK would link with another country that perhaps is more in their early stages of really grappling with teaching or talking about the Holocaust, like Lithuania or perhaps the Czech Republic. And they would do what is changed its name, but bilateral liaison, where there would be workshops and ways to work through how you're going to talk about something where there is a different history in this country. There will be things that actually are uncomfortable to know, not just during the war, but afterwards, and attempts to do it. But I'm not sure what to say to you, apart from the, we believe in formal education, but wider education too. I think most, there is a lot of good work going on, but there's more to be done. I don't really know what else I can say, but I don't know if you've got any insight.
Well, it was actually 20 years ago that we met with the three Baltic state presidents, which led to their announcement they were creating international historical commissions, effectively to address the question about the Holocaust in those countries. Of course, these were countries that even before the war ended were annexed to the Soviet Union in 1991, 1989, and they saw themselves as victims of communism for half a century. It was not an easy process. And the question of how effective a kind of formal historical commission would be is a genuine question. How deeply rooted would it happen? I can recall that Leonard Meri, who was president of Estonia, when he said we were going to create these commissions, he looked to a diplomat from Finland to cheer it, because he said to me, we don't have any historians in Estonia we can trust. So when you talk about how do you get to this history when no one was able to address it, it is a real challenge. But I think we have to see, along with that, in January, the Claims Conference commissioned a survey on knowledge, importance of the Holocaust here in the United States. You have 40% of the population who can't identify Auschwitz. So on the one hand, it can be a very particular history in these countries, wasn't addressed during the communist period, hard to see how we can really put it in place now, but I think more people are understanding or doing something. And then the reality, even here, if there's something, a silver lining in this, even if people don't know it, a vast majority say it's important to have it as part of our education.
This gentleman right here, I think is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th row on this side.
Also, Ira, there's somebody that you can't see over there.
Oh,
just so
okay.
You know. He's moving.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a member of the Foreign Service, now retired. I'd like to ask a couple of questions that relate to anti-Semitism in Europe. The first is, have you found what kind of linkages among Europeans with anti-Semitism and anti-Arab, anti-Islamic feeling? Are they typically linked, or are some people able to compartmentalize and have strong feelings against Jews, but not necessarily against Muslims, or vice versa? And the second is the anti-Semitism among the Arab Muslim population that you mentioned. Does that typically come hard-baked within these immigrants, or are they coming with a tendency, anti-Semitism tendency based on their history and education, but it's strongly reinforced by the environment that they're in?
To the first question, you are beginning to see a kind of look. In most of these Western European countries, there's strongly negative views toward Muslims. They're not the same level of intensity when it comes to attitudes toward Jews, but those attitudes toward Jews are becoming more negative. I know we were together with one of the directors of Pew who'd been doing these surveys, who's saying there is now, with this sort of growing nationalism, populism, a tendency to see Jews more negatively. And I don't think ever were Europeans viewing Jews in the warm ways that Americans view Jews. And in some areas, they really are linked together. We didn't speak about this, but in parts of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, efforts to restrict ritual circumcision or ban religious slaughter, Jews and Muslims, for better or worse, are linked together on those things. There's really no getting away from it. We don't have survey data really on the attitudes of these new migrants. We do have data that looks to people who've been in Europe for some time from these countries. Again, one of the hard problems is to get governments and others to say, look specifically, really, if you're going to do survey work, do it in such a way that you can disaggregate and tell which parts of these communities hold these more negative views. France, as a government, never wants to even examine this, but there have been private surveys done with Jews, Muslim background, Muslim identity, and they do hold more negative views toward Jews, and those negative views actually increase with the religious intensity or involvement of those Muslims in France. There's a correlation. Whether we're going to see it with these new migrants that come in, I think many of us are nervous, even if right now we don't have a clear data that would show that those attitudes are, as you say, we've said, are baked in and can't be changed.
And just a very short answer on your first question about other people who are anti-Semitic, also anti-Muslim. What I would say is when the experience that we're dealing with the hard left, these people are only anti-Jewish.
On your first question, there are members, for example, of the Alternative for Germany party. It's a right-wing extremist xenophobic party that's in the parliament and now in all 16 German states, who are politicians within this party who are both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim. But there are also pro-Israel politicians and pro-Jewish community politicians, and a Jewish group that just formed within the party, German Jews for the Alternative for German Party. So it's a really mixed bag. On your second question, I think the answer is yes to both questions. The Muslim migrants and refugees who are coming, for example, from Syria, I'll take that case as an example, are socialized in an anti-Semitic environment in Syria. If you look at their school book texts, there was a study done. I think you'll find a JTA story about a study that was done a number of years ago, and there was something recent too, if you Google it. And then they enter Germany, where you have a climate also of extraordinarily high anti-Semitic attitudes within the country. And also, as I mentioned, this secondary anti-Semitism, or this guilt offensiveness anti-Semitism, and you begin to mix that together, and you can imagine what type of cocktail you have.
Well, yeah, I'm, as I said, frustrated that we don't have more time. We've run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Andy, Karen, and Benjamin. I think some of them may stick around. We're going to have a break now. I've been told till 11:15 for coffee, et cetera, and bathroom break, et cetera. So if they're around, I'm sure you can grab them. They're a font of wisdom. I want to thank them very much for their time today.
Thank you.